Good morning, everybody. This is a rehearsal for my comms paper defense. The title of the paper is Situating the Validity Argument, Lessons from Feminist Epistemologies. Epistemology refers to the philosophical study of nature, origin, and limits of human knowledge. In general, the term derived from the Greek episteme and logos, and accordingly to and it's usually referred as theory of knowledge. And test validity actually depends a lot on what epistemology a researcher advises, or what's the more core philosophical idea on how you can know, how you can generate knowledge. When we validate a test, we typically use some theoretical background, what Kronbach and Mill called the nomological network, and even defining a nomological network has some assumptions on how you generate knowledge. So the philosophy in which you are starting your process of validating a test can have a big influence on how exactly do you do the validation of a test and what might be the blind spots in that process. The purpose of this study, I would say research, or maybe even can be considered as a literature review at some point. It is more like a, I don't know, like a paper, I would say, is to examine the epistemologies developed by feminist scholars. There was a big movement in the 70s, in the 80s, in which a lot of feminist scholars started to think about these philosophical questions about science and knowledge generation and objectivity. And they came up with very good ideas on how to generate knowledge in a way that is aware of structures of oppression, and also generate knowledge in a way that does collude with structures of oppression. So the purpose of this paper is to examine the epistemology developed by those feminist scholars in the 80s and identify from those ideas presented there ways in which we can include all this philosophy into test validation. So in order to do that, I think we should start by doing a short review of what are the current epistemologies, or what are, in my opinion, the epistemologies that some authors in validity theory have been like using. And there are at least three that can be identified. So first, there is one epistemology called realism, which assumes that there is a real world and somehow is independent from the knowing subject. So this sense of reality that is in natural science, at least very, very strongly, that there is some independent nature that you can ask things to, and through experimentation or through gathering of evidence, you can respond to questions, and there is a truth to be discovered. Usually realism assumes that when we do science, it's not just about knowledge, it's about like having true claims about what is real. So that's kind of like the mindset of the realist epistemology. And one author in test validity that that can be considered a realist is Borsboom. He has this definition about the test validity, assuming two things: that a test is valid if the construct exists, and a second one in which there is a causal difference between differences in the construct with differences in the test. And yeah, usually realism takes something that is called ontology. Ontology means what are the things that we assume that exist. And that's why also Bertrand connect with this idea of existence, and the truth value at the end depends on the ontology, meaning that what we believe that is true is the thing that gives true value for the claims that we can discover through scientific work. Constructionism is a different take. In constructionism, you don't assume that there is a complete independent reality. Every knowledge is basically assumed to be socially constructed. And even if there could be a reality, that reality is inescapably contingent and rhetorical. Contingent means that is dependent of a context, and rhetorical means that it will depend a lot on who is listening to the case, if you want, about any scientific claim. So Kane can be considered a constructionist. Usually constructionism depends a lot on not only on what you are researching, but also in the way that you are presenting the research. So Kane arguments-based approach actually is very rhetorical in that regard, because you are not just validating, but centering the validation around the way you want to present it. So that's a very clear constructionist trait. Messick at some point can be considered a constructionist in the sense that when he defines validity as an evaluative judgment. And the fact that he is assuming that validity is a judgment, that makes his definition of validity very constructionist, even though the way that he defines later appropriateness and adequacy. There is one author called Marcus that he claims that one part of that, the evidential part of the validity framework in Messick can be considered realist, and the consequential basis can be considered constructionist. So, but yeah, Ms. Levy on the other side makes this observation that Messick, beyond this distinction on the evidential and the consequential, both are an evaluative judgment. So in Ms. Levy's opinion, this can be constructionist. Now, people confuse the term constructionist with constructionism, and the difference is that constructionist is on the specific researcher constructing something. Constructionism is when you have more people doing that process in a kind of co-constructed way. So I would tend to prefer the constructionism, because constructivist in a strict sense is not completely scientific, because it's just one person doing it. And finally, critical realism. Critical realism is kind of in between. So it accepts that there is some reality that exists, and there is some truth to be discovered, but it still assumes also that the knowledge is socially constructed. And one author that can be considering that epistemology is Ms. Levy. Ms. Levy, he has this model-based reasoning, if you want. Yeah, reasoning, I think is the word he used. And this idea that when we build a test, we have models, and those models approach reality, but not completely, but there is a reality to approach. Now, there is also some other term that is important to understand when we speak about feminist epistemologies in particular. So the idea of structuralism and post-structuralism. So structuralism was a movement of French philosophers in the early 1900s. And the idea is that there is some sort of abstract structure that can explain phenomena. That's the idea of structuralism. So if you want to make it more clear or more easy to understand what structuralism is, it's basically assuming that there is some sort of SEM model behind phenomena. So that an SEM model is a very structuralist thing. And so it's not exactly like a logic that defines exactly everything that happened, but there's some sort of abstract structure that kind of more or less explain what's going on. Post-structuralism was another movement from French authors that they started to criticize that and reject that. And they started to see that those structures that eventually could be there actually were not structures. Maybe they were just discourses. Maybe they were just a language being used in some way. Maybe they were used, I don't know, like for structure of power. So there were like many criticisms by different authors like Derrida, like Foucault, and they started to create these post-movement that is usually named as post-structuralism. And yeah, they reject the idea that there's one single abstract structure behind phenomena, and they kind of explain why it can happen, that maybe not. So here I made like a little graphic of authors and where authors interest validity and where we can use, where we can locate them. These, I mean, these are epistemologies. Philosophy can be tricky. There are many details that maybe I am not completely capturing, and also it was my opinion from what I read of these from these authors. So definitely Wormsmuth can be considered a realist. Miss Levy is tricky. He positioned in everything. I mean, in any category that I found, he said, yes, I am that. So yeah, Miss Levy is I don't know, it's weird to see an author that can be everything. Yeah, it's a bit omnipotent at some point. Messick, I put it here in between, meaning that can be considered a realist, a critical realist, or some sort of mixture between realism and constructionism. Maybe yes, maybe not. So I put it like right in between. Steve, actually, well, we talked together and he told me I am a critical realist, or I would be like with Miss Levy. From what I read from you, Steve, I'm not sure if that's exactly right. So that's why I also put yourself kind of in the same way like Messick. So yeah, we can talk more about that. Dixon, Roman, and Jürgen, they also consider themselves social construction, which is different from constructionism. And they also consider themselves as pragmatic. So this is also another philosophy. I'm not going to go too much detail on this in this presentation, but yeah, all these authors consider themselves pragmatic, or in the case of Miss Levy, neo-pragmatic. Kane, I would say he's constructionist, but he's not necessarily purely pragmatic. He's more consequentialist rather than utilitarian. What does it mean? That all these authors usually have some idea of utility and some utility for society that needs to be checked when you're validating. Kane, on the other side, considers the possibility of doing some sort of utility analysis to use as a warrant for claims related with use, but also he considered the idea of consequences that cannot be accepted in any case and should not be part of any sum or any like adding up of to come up with a utility. So that's slightly different. That's not strictly utilitarian, that's consequentialist. That's from moral philosophy. Myself, I propose some ideas around validity. I would like to stay here. I'm not sure if I am here, but I would like to stay here. Jennifer's work, I would consider her post-structuralist, and because it's very aware of the structures of power and all the ideas coming from critical race theory. I would dare to say it is post-structuralist. But yeah, here I'm not completely sure. This is my impression rather than a true thing, if you want. So, about feminist epistemologies. There is one thing called a standpoint theory that has been developed by many feminist scholars. And the idea is that when you are knowing about the structures of oppression, you should start by the experiences and lives of the oppressed. So here are three claims from feminist standpoint theory: that knowledge is socially socially situated. Marginalized groups are socially situated in ways that make it more possible for them to be aware of things and ask questions that it is for the non-marginalized. And research, particularly focused on power relationships, should begin with the lives of the marginalized. This is also known as the epistemic privilege. What does it mean? Epistemic privilege means that not all people have the same capacity to know about everything. And because of the life experiences, there are some groups that might be better suited to respond certain questions, and they have some advantage, if you want, to know certain things. That's why it's the idea of epistemic knowledge privilege advantage, you know. So standpoint theory, the idea of standpoint means that you create some sort of awareness of your condition as oppressed, and you create some sort of political movement around that, like a co-construction with others. And from there, you can have certain epistemic privilege to respond to certain questions. So standpoint theory, for example, feminism can be considered a standpoint because there was like a social movement and a co-construction and a thinking process about becoming more aware of the oppression that happened against women. And then the women, from this standpoint, they have certain epistemic privileges to speak about things that they have suffered in particular, like, for example, oppression against women, and how that oppression have been more very specific about the bodies, about the identities, about how women in general has been forced to take certain roles in society, etc. In all that discussion, there was one author called Donna Haraway, and she wrote this beautiful paper that I love so much, Situated Knowledges, the Science Question in Feminism and the Privilege of Partial Perspective. This paper, it's almost like a manifesto, if you want. It's like a very fundamental core paper about epistemology and how to know. And she provides a very special perspective that I consider it would be important to review and connect with our practices in test validation. And that's that's also a big part of the paper, and that's why also the title of the paper is Situating the Validity Argument, because it is thinking about this idea of the situated knowledges, the concept that Donna Haraway created. So the one idea that Donna Haraway presented is the idea of the God trick. God trick is a criticism to both constructionist and realist epistemologies. And the criticism is that both epistemologies usually assume that the researcher has some sort of God position, meaning that it's not particularly bounded to anywhere, and also it can eventually potentially see from everywhere. And that assumption, when we know that is what Donna Haraway called the God trick. And the observation that Donna Haraway does is that it is never the case. I mean, we always first are physically situated because we are human beings, and also the capacities for ourselves as observers is limited too. We cannot see everything. We cannot see it from everywhere. They are like a practical limitation in terms of what we can do. I put this excerpt here from her work because she posed the problem of the epistemological question in this way. So I think our problem is how to have simultaneously an account of radical historical contingency of all knowledge gained and knowing subjects, a critical practice for recognizing our semantic technologies for making meanings, and a no-nonsense commitment to faithful accounts of a real world, one that can be partially shared and that is friendly to earth-wide projects of finite freedom, adequate material abundance, modest meaning in suffering, and limited happiness. So she criticized basically this pretension of omnipotence when we know. And the way in which she poses the problem shows us like very important part of the knowledge generation. First, how this partiality relates on how we can speak about the historical contingency of the research happening, meaning like the historical context and all the related things that can be happening around research that can have a lot of influence in the research itself. So it's not, for example, to do science in the Nazi regime versus democratic country. So those contextual elements can shape a lot the argument. And if we don't speak out that, we are missing the point in how exactly we are explaining how to know, in the how to know question, like how are we coming up with a conclusion. This other idea of the recognizing the semiotic technology. Semiotic means the signs or the symbols, if you want. Semiotic technology at the end means that how exactly do you present the knowledge? How do you exactly do you write, if you want, the results, or like, I don't know, the experimentation process? That semiotic technology can also affect a lot the way we know. So in test validation, argument-based approach, for example, the argument, it's a semiotic technology. But actually that can limit the way we present the ideas about the validity of a test. And finally, this idea of the no-nonsense commitment. So the no-nonsense is a weird word. I mean, it's like a double negation, but I kind of like it because the idea is that in the context of doing science, we have been embedded in a Western society that is kind of nonsensical. And this nonsense is very specific also to capitalism and the role of science in the economic structure. So that's why I also explain about this idea of finite freedom with material abundance. So it's kind of criticizing that science, we typically do it in a way that is kind of trying to take all nature and make use of all of that and have this kind of super knowledge that can help humanity forever and ever to do everything, like uh, very maximalist. And she's kind of looking for a different sense, the different cosmology eventually, and um, a different spirit, if you want, to do science, in which we are okay with having limited the projects of limited happiness, basically, assuming that science is not going to resolve anything. And I like this picture in particular because this is a very example of how the observer is always there. So even if this person wanted to see something, the object of his study came to him and climbed on him. So it's not that he's God and can see from nowhere. He is going to be there, and the object of his study actually can affect him back. So even if this person is doing an observation about cheetahs, how this concrete act of the subject in the researcher can affect the way in which the researcher is observing. That's why I look kind of like this picture. And the solution that Donna Haraway proposes, the idea of an epistemology of partial perspective. Basically, what she's proposing is that when we do science, we should disclose in what ways we are partial. That's it. And not just disclose, like kind of acknowledge and own the partiality of our gaze. And the interesting thing is that Donna Haraway poses this idea that true objectivity is not about trying to be God, and we cannot trying to be God and trying to be perfectly impartial. True objectivity is about disclosing what we can make no, what can be making us partial. That's the point. And I love this also, this other idea of how partial perspective promises objective vision, and how this criticism of this kind of distance that can be assumed in the process of how to know is just part of the context, and it's part of the Western cultural narratives in which we are embedded. That's all. I mean, that we are doing science in a way that is very situated anyways, and very kind of yeah, culturally biased, if you want. Yeah. Another criticism that Donna Haraway does is the idea of vision devices. So she uses the idea of that when we do an experiment, we create vision devices like a microscope, like a telescope, some technology that can help us to see. But when we do that, there will be there is a power move. That's an expression that she uses, meaning that there is someone that is going to be left behind, and someone that is going to be unseen, and someone that is going to be seen better. So basically, vision has some problem there in that it can focalize somewhere, but it also has a lot of spots in which you cannot focalize. It's part of the problem of vision in general as a sensitory system. And she poses this question: with whose blood were my eyes craft? Meaning that when we do a vision device, we are going to affect people potentially, and we are going to see or not visualize correctly some people. That's the blood, meaning that that's the the people that are going to be affected by the power move in the decisions when we make a vision device. So a test is a vision device because we make inferences and we make eventually true claims about the person. So that's C, that's like making appear something. And that question with whose blood were my eyes craft is quintessential in all validation practices. Who is going to be misinterpreted? Who is going to be who is going to be incorrectly measured? Who is going to be incorrectly assessed? And that's that criticism that she made. She didn't make it specifically for psychological tests, for educational tests, but definitely applies to us. And in this idea of the situated knowledges, she also goes more into detail on what exactly it would look like this in practice, in this consideration of partiality and embodiment when we do research. And she put this table that kind of contrasts what she believes is like the mainstream way of doing science and this new way she proposed. And it's complicated to kind of put it in more concrete ground, but when you see authors that have been speaking about situated knowledges and how also Dana Haraway explained herself, the idea is that situated knowledges is at the end is a multi-perspective account of what is real. So she speaks about having at least double vision, meaning that I interpret it in this way, meaning that the knowledge is not just about knowledge, knowledge is also about the conversation about knowledge. So knowledge generation should include the conversations around that knowledge that you want to generate. That is knowledge. That is not just an extra thing. And this is particularly more clear, master theories versus web accounts. So master theory means that there is some structure of oppression, and the master, the one that has the power, he has, or yeah, I would say he, because that most likely is going to be a man, but yeah, let's say, okay, they have a theory, and that theory have so many, can have assumptions and can have ways of knowing that can be oppressive, and these are consistent with the system of oppression that make the master a master. And a web account is kind of the opposite. It's more about everyone else that is not the master, and how we talk about that theory and what we experience and understand about whatever is said from the theory. And this idea of the situated knowledge basically is also acknowledging that knowledge is always situated, and you need, in order to know, you need to connect with the context in which knowledge is happening, and also in which knowledge is going to be transferred or used, if you want. Another big part of the experience, another part of situated knowledges is the idea of participatory research. So Donna Haraway is extremely clear into saying that any attempt to build a true situated knowledge must be participatory. And more exactly, what she means is that subjects cannot be considered an object, should be considered agents. Because when you consider them as agents, they will have the power and the voice to do the actual situated knowledge construction. And you will be able to listen to their experiences and have that epistemic privilege that also comes from the ideas of standpoint theory to enrich knowledge and have this true double vision and not a master theory. So how exactly is that we can include all these ideas into test validation? I mean, we are experts in test validation, and there are many philosophical things here going on, but how exactly more concrete ways we can include these ideas? So one interesting thing that we can do is to include what is called the positionality of the validity of researcher in a validity argument. So positionality refers to all the identitary things that makes a researcher and can eventually also affect the research. So race, education, sexual orientation, class, culture, all of that can affect the ways in which we know, the assumptions and biases and tendencies and I don't know, the whole research process can be affected by our identities, by who we are. And part of this denial, the kind of this breaking through the gut trick is to make us visible and make us also accountable, because if we are visible, we are going to be made accountable and explain, I am from here, I am this, I am this and this, and even eventually we can explain in more honest ways or fears about how we can be biased. Consideration of contextual elements. Teresa Flores, she's a researcher from Chile. She is great. She has been doing a great job in Chile, actually. And from her, I learned this idea of doing an analysis about context and about discourses and about what's the context in which the test is going to be used. Her dissertation actually was a analysis of discourses around the test used for accountability in Chile, for school accountability in Chile. And she did this beautiful work of a three-dimensional study, three-dimensional analysis of the discourses around the test. And yeah, this work for me is like something that we should be reading and something that can be a reasonable template for other studies about contextual elements when we validate and use the test. Inquiries on structures of power. Actually, Jennifer's paper on color neutral is not a thing. She included in her recommendation for questions one specific section about power. I think that's also it makes sense a lot with the idea of situated knowledges, in that when we acknowledge that research is situated, we need to understand also what is the context, and particularly what are the structures of oppression that are around us and can be part of the text. So basically, when we are validating this, I think it's completely fair to ask ourselves, is this test going to be functional for a structure of power? And in what ways? That is a question to me. That's a question perfectly actually subject. So it can be a subject of inquiry. The idea of a structure of oppression and how exactly that can happen. And the question that Jennifer included, I think, goes in that direction. I think this is a great example on how to do inquiry specific on structures of power. So how does the construct perpetuate hegemonic values that result in supremacist knowledge values? That's a question about the structures of power and how the construct can, in the test, can be related with that structure of power. So this is a great example on how we can do that and basically respond to this question. Inclusion of a phenomenological aspect of assessment. Phenomenological means how do you live on your inside, on within, like the experience of having, of being assessed. And with Steve, well, actually this paper might change his title, but the idea we have been developing this conceptual framework about experience, and we talk about some principles about the experience and how we can include information about the experiences of users when doing the test. That also situates a lot the validity argument, because you start to include the voices of the examinees and all other stakeholders and include that into the validation process. Participatory research. There are, at least to my knowledge, 2 cases of people that have been doing already participatory research when constructing large scale assessments, if you want. And this particular case of Hawaii, they did like a reasonable effort that can be considered, in my opinion, participatory in this idea of what they call cultural validity. I don't like too much the concept cultural validity, because it reminds the faceted aspect of cultural validity, which can be this non-unitary way of looking at validity that I don't like and has been kind of discarded from a long time. But yeah, okay, yeah, let's, yeah. I mean, but let's say cultural, meaning that this sensibility to make validity, listening to the people and with them, not without them, you know. Adi, Maddox, and Zumbo, they wrote this beautiful paper about PISA and how PISA, I think it's PISA D, I can't remember the test, but yeah, it's one of the PISA tests. And they tried to expand the PISA to other countries that were beyond the OCDE, the ODC, no, OECD, yeah, OECD. And they struggled to do that. And actually, there are countries that they refused to take the PISA because the questions were obviously wrong. And for example, there was like one specific case in which Adi showed that in India, PISA was pretending to ask a question about ATMs to kids that they have never seen one ATM. So, and she speaks about this idea of assembled arguments, meaning that when you, if you are going to write an argument, you should be able to have an argument that can be more flexible if you want. So this idea of the Turing model, she criticized that, and she kind of criticized the kind of universality of the argument, this unique argument for everybody, when actually the argument might require to be very different. And actually, if you want to make an experience comparable, maybe the test actually should be different, but the argument, and also the argument should be maybe different, but to come up with a similar conclusion. So yeah, this idea of assembled arguments, I think, is another way to make the validations more situated, meaning that you need to consider the possibility of having different arguments for different subgroups. And this is more about my own ideas about the experiential approach to validation. I explained this in another presentation before, but this idea of reversing the confirmationist way in which we do validation, I do some sort of falsificationist way, meaning that we study user experience, we come up with invalidity hypotheses, we then disprove those hypotheses, and that make the validation process in that order. And then present this to the communities and kind of have an appraisal phase, like a review of the argument with the communities, and as a continuation also of the validation effort. So in terms of conclusions, I think there are like two core things that come from the feminist epistemologies that should be included in our validation practices. First is what I call the partiality question validation. So we can always ask this question: in what ways is this validity argument partial and situated? So every time we validate a test, I think we should put a little bit of gaze in ourselves and in the context and in the situatedness of the argument. And be very candid about the partiality of the validation effort. That's I think is one of the that is part of the embodiment and the situatedness that Haraway tried to push. And even if you're not going all the way with situated knowledges, I think her point is very strong in that when we don't do this, we are missing a lot about the validity argument. You need to put the validity argument in context in order to be correctly understood, to be well understood. And also, the validation should be participatory. So it's not just about knowing about the experiences. It's not just about having subjects as generators of data. It's about giving them agency in the validation process, meaning that, I mean, what exactly that can happen? I have my own ideas. In the experiential approach, I consider that the community should prioritize between invalidity hypotheses, and that should bring problematizations of anything related with the test. But that's only one way. I mean, what exactly can, I mean, the more concrete way in which that can happen, I don't know. But the idea in general is to give agency to the people taking the test and the communities affected by the use of the test in the validation of the test. And that's it. Those are the two core ideas of that I believe should be included in future validation efforts, and the value of epistemology, feminist epistemologies. Thank you very much.